So this week in gaming, we start with Hogwarts Legacy, because let's be honest, it's still the biggest thing out right now. We start with weird news, that it currently has no plans for DLC. It says Avalanche Software. I've got to be honest, I'll be amazed if this is actually true. Despite the fact that this game's been a roaring success past what I think everybody expected, they've said they don't currently have plans to do any. We've really been heads down bringing Hogwarts Legacy to life, so at the moment, there's no current plans for DLC. And to me, that just sounds more like PR speak. Yes, we know, you all like the game, you're all playing the game, and it's got a lot of bugs. And so we don't want to talk about content in the future. I don't believe they don't actually have plans for it. They know whether they're going to make any or not, and let's be honest, they'd be insane not to with how popular the game is. I also think when you like a game, you want more content for it to be produced so you can continue liking the game. So I don't really know what the problem is, but I think we can all think of times in the past where a game's been released with bugs. Where they're like, yeah, in 2 months we're going to have expansion pack 1. And it just implies that they're not really focused on fixing the current problems, and they're already looking into the future. So I think this is more like a white lie, so people don't accuse them of taking their eye off the ball. It's more reassurance that we're definitely going to sort out those bugs first. Because the article states that he's deliberately leaving the possibility for post-launch expansion packs open. He just isn't able to confirm anything at this stage with potential DLC, which you would have expected when he's like, well, we're not really talking about that right now because we're focusing on the launch of the game. But he went further than that to say there's no current plans to even make any, which definitely sounds more like a no than a, look, we're just focusing on the game's launch right now, and we'll think about DLC later. So I think it's strange to give such a definitive answer if there's no plans at all, rather than go, well, we are going to do that in the future, but right now we're definitely focused on the launch and no one's currently working on it. Now, one of the reasons they may have taken that tack is because they are so scared of stirring up even more controversy over this game. They don't want to say anything even remotely controversial because it will be looked through by the magnifying glass, and so many people just want any opportunity to attack this game. We've even got it where Hogwarts Legacy fans want to be mean, but the game just doesn't let them. People desperately trying to be evil, and they can't do it. And I can understand with the choices in the game, it's like, oh, I'm going to keep these marbles to myself. Isn't exactly a good or evil choice in the first place. But there is one specific exception. The unforgivable curses, and just how, for some reason, they're so forgivable. You would have thought in a game like Hogwarts Legacy, that would have been a major deal. But it seems like it was a deliberate decision in order not to judge people, no matter how horrific the actions they took were. Because they have pitched their idea of morality in this game very strangely. Hogwarts Legacy wants to let you be a dark witch or wizard. If you want to be evil, be evil. And you're like, okay, fair enough. But that should change people's reactions to you. It should have consequences if you go down one path over another. You should experience different people reacting to you in different ways. And that's not what Hogwarts Legacy developers wanted to have. They said giving the option of unforgivable curses was not a decision made lightly. But we think we struck a good balance, because allowing the player to be evil, we want this game to come from a place of non-judgment by the creators. The reason why there's no consequences in the game for any evil action isn't because they don't think the characters would actually do that for you. It's because the developers themselves wanted it to be consequence-free, because they didn't feel like they wanted to judge you. If you wanted to go through the world annihilating everybody, then they think that's just fine. That's a greater decision as everything else. And I think most people would agree that if you're evil in a game, that's fine. It's just a game. But there should still be consequences in that game. People should still not like you. There should be judgment from within the game, the characters in the game, of the actions that you've taken. And I think by removing that judgment, by removing the consequences, you've removed any reason to be it in the first place. If every action leads to the same place, if every action leads to the same non-judgment from everyone in the world, then you remove any reason to make a decision in the first place. I actually think this is probably the worst decision of Hogwarts Legacy, because a place without judgment is to remove morality from the game at all, which removes any reason to make a moral choice. And considering that's the foundation of their entire story, I don't think removing consequences was really a good idea. But there is more stuff coming to Hogwarts. There's a multiplayer mod in the works coming from the people who made Skyrim together. And apparently it's much easier to make than it was in Skyrim and might come as soon as next month. This comes down to the fact that Unreal Engine games are much easier to mod than Bethesda. And they can actually just copy and paste a lot of the work that was already done for Skyrim straight over into this new project. And when looking for these stories, sometimes you just stumble across things which you kind of wish you'd never stumbled across. Like people making up their own fanfiction for various different characters within the game. Oh look, these two characters are friends in the game. That must mean there's something more to it. and it makes me just feel like I'm third wheeling in my own single player experience. Which, considering there's specifically no romance in Hogwarts, I don't know, it just feels like a bit of a stretch to me. Speaking of which, Overwatch was a game that was largely abandoned for multiple years, but then Overwatch 2 came out and everyone was like, oh, it's the same game with about a year's worth of work added to it. What were you doing again during all of that development time? Well, it turns out they were making things like a dating sim. This is a browser spin-off game, and is apparently 100% official, but not actually canon. This is Loverwatch, featuring text-based dialogue options with conversations flowing between people like Mercy and Genji. It's only short and available for a limited time, and even features dialogue options where the developers take the piss out of how they've barely done any work over the last few years. So what can I say except thank you, Blizzard, for remaining the quality developer that you've always been. It's definitely doing lots of work in the office. Speaking of browser games that I never really expected to find out about, there's a movie called Cocaine Bear coming out in the near future, who has also come out with their own browser version. This is basically Pacman, but you play the insane bear. A £175 bear that was found near the $2 million worth of the illicit substance, and obviously being a browser game and designed to advertise a comedy movie, it's a bare bones game at best. But then again, in a world where Blizzard and Overwatch are doing exactly the same thing, I'm actually quite impressed by the effort. And it's something that not many movies do, so hey, points for creativity. Next up, we find out that Blizzard isn't the only developer that's just regularly disappointing their old customers, as we move on to Destiny 2 and Lightfall. We find out that players who finish the new expansion will need to pay to skip it on their alt characters. Destiny 2, never a game to skip an opportunity to dive into your wallet, has called the ability to skip the campaign on your alts an excellent feature. But not when they have to pay for it. Now, I've always been dubious of any game that allows you to pay to skip content, specifically because it means that your game is crap to begin with. If people want to skip your content, it wasn't very good. And when a developer actually adds in a feature to make you pay to skip it, then it gives them an incentive to make the content crap, so you want to skip it. I would vastly prefer incentives where you pay a developer, which then makes them do a good thing and want to behave in some kind of good behavior. Whereas this is the exact opposite. You are now paying them, rewarding them for making the game inconvenient, making the game boring, slow, or too grindy to want to do more than once. For me, at that point, it moves past what the price is or whether it's value for money, and instead the idea that this can only get worse and this feature will only ever lead to bad and worse behavior in the future. This is an idea which is rotten at the very core and can only lead to poorer products for the customers. And worse, it's making them pay for the privilege. If players don't want to rerun the campaign on other alts, that's fine, you could have done the feature for free. But the moment you start paying and rewarding the developer for making content that you don't want to play, that's not just a slippery slope, that's a cliff. For the other side of the coin now, if Blizzard and the developers at Overwatch 2 barely do any work, then what happens if you just seem to be pumping out games too much? Because that could be the situation that we find ourselves in with the developers of Tomb Raider, who want to release 5 AAA games over the next 5 years. Now, these games will come from 2 developers, and we know it's possible because Call of Duty do it with annual releases of games, and they switch over developers back and forth, so each developer essentially releases biannually. The question is, if we're using COD as the example, is that the example you actually want to release? Because let's be honest, COD doesn't really change much in between releases. There's very minor changes to the movement or the guns. Most of it revolves around maps and skins, with slightly thematical changes between the different styles of everything else. That's very different than what this seems to be, where we're talking about 5 entirely new games. 2 years is a relatively short development cycle, and you will end up with games that come across very similar. Just look at Assassin's Creed. Players burn out on it because there just isn't that many changes. When you constantly want people to buy the next game in the series when they'd still just recently bought the old one, you can very quickly hit player burnout. Now, they have defined what AAA games mean for them, saying that it needs over 100 full-time developers working on it at its peak, and will all have significant marketing budgets behind them, with an expectation that they sell at least 2 million units each. Now, the article has theorized Perfect Dark will count as one of them. There's going to be a Tomb Raider game, as well as a rumored Deus Ex game in very early development. They're not doing a Call of Duty or an Assassin's Creed, where we're just going to bang out the same IP every year for 5 years and make everyone bored with it. But with all that, we just loop back to what I said at the start. Really, is 2 years enough? Do you have the developers and the time to come out with completely original games that often in that shorter space of time? It's certainly possible if you run enough teams and hire enough developers, but how many people start dropping plates the moment they start spinning too many? That's the real question. Speaking of trying to spin plates and just dropping all of them, did you know that the Saints reboot actually cost over $100 million to make? And the Saints reboot was a massive disaster. Not only was it not a good game, but it was obviously going to flop right from the very launch announcement, because it wasn't even Saints Row. They changed everything about it, and they were proud of it. These people weren't making a Saints Row game. They acted as if they were ashamed of the Saints Row franchise and the kind of jokes it's made, its attitude. They didn't want anything to do with it. And they released a making-of video where they were so proud that they'd hired all of these new young developers that had absolutely no idea what Saints Row was. This was a reboot to its very core. This was something that wanted to take a new IP, destroy what came before, and show you their new vision for the world. A safe, politically correct one. One which didn't offend anybody or make any nasty little comments about any particular person. This was a game that was going to be safe, and an IP that certainly wasn't. Now, it got slated by its players, and I don't think it actually sold that much. So to find out that it reportedly cost over $100 million, I have to ask, this was an Epic exclusive. How much of their money went into that budget? Apparently the figure comes from a fan site that went through the entertainment conglomerate's financial report and came alongside news that their PC and console segment is feeling the sting of underperforming releases earlier in the financial year, which anyone could have told you that this game was going to underperform right from its very first launch announcement. Apparently the cost is well known behind the scenes, and the value of completed games in that quarter is $160 million, and considering they had few games released in that period, the user thinks that that's not a bold statement to make. At the Q&A, he said, "I stated before release that we were confident in the financial profile of the investment, but obviously I had hoped for a greater reception of the game. It's been a very polarized view, if by polarized you mean everyone agreed it was awful. And there are a lot of things that could be said in detail. On the one hand, I'm happy to see a lot of gamers and fans happy. At the same time, I'm a bit sad to see lots of fans not happy. It's difficult." To which I can only say, you only had to do one thing to keep the fans of Saints Row happy, and that was release a Saints Row game. And you didn't. For some reason, you let the people in charge of that product be ashamed of their history, ashamed of the very IP that they were making and developing for. That should have been your first red flag. That should have been when you got rid of the people in charge. But instead, you let them hire a load of new people that also didn't like the game, that thought they could change it, thought that they were better than the people that came before, and knew better what the fans wanted than the fans themselves. They even came out on Twitter and attacked the fans when they pointed out that this wasn't a Saints Row game. You wanted to take an edgy IP, take something with a comedy angle, and then reduce it to its basic form, turn it into a grey mush, make it completely inoffensive to everybody involved. But the issue is, if you take the Saints Row out of a Saints Row game, then what you end up with is just a boring pile of trash that nobody wants to play, and they certainly don't want to pay you for it. Diablo 4 news now, and beta tests are coming out next month. Obviously, your progress won't carry through to the main game, but there'll be a beta early access test from March 17th to 19th, and an open beta from March 24th to 26th. And we'll include the game's prologue and the opening act called Fractured Peaks. We also get a new teaser trailer for it, although, seriously, nothing happens, especially considering the quality of trailers and movies that Diablo has had in the past. This one's a particular low point for me, but if you do play both betas, then your progress will carry on in between betas, just not through to the actual release. The full release of which will be on June the 6th. But for now, that's it from me. Let me know what you thought of any of the topics down below. Like the video if you like the video, subscribe, more videos like this in the future, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.